Do you know who I am? I can buy this entire hospital and fire you before you even clock out!
Shamika Duckerson lived a life dedicated to healing. As a top-tier ICU nurse, she worked tirelessly, picking up extra shifts to prepare for the arrival of her baby. To her colleagues, Shamika was just a kind-hearted, hard-working woman with a gentle smile and a quiet demeanor. She never spoke about her past, her family, or the world she grew up in. She preferred the sterile, predictable environment of the hospital over the dangerous, high-stakes underworld of her childhood. No one knew that the quiet black nurse changing IV bags was the cherished foster sister of Park Hyun-woo, the most feared and ruthless Korean mafia boss in the city. Hyun-woo had shielded her from his dark world, honoring her wish to live a normal, peaceful life away from violence. But peace is fragile. When an entitled billionaire named Nick Hunter walked into Shamika's ICU, used to getting his way through bullying and wealth, their worlds violently collided. Nick thought he was just putting a nobody in her place. He had no idea that by laying a hand on Shamika, he wasn't just breaking hospital rules, he was signing his own destruction. Hello viewers, welcome to Afro K Mafia Diary. Please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for more amazing stories of ultimate karma. Now let's get into the story. The lights in the intensive care unit were always bright, and the machines never stopped. Shamika checked the monitors in room 4 with a practiced eye. Her lower back ached. Being 7 months pregnant made 12-hour shifts much harder, but she never complained. The younger nurses looked up to her. When a patient crashed or a family cried, Shamika was the calm center of the storm. She rubbed her swollen belly gently, taking a deep breath before stepping into the hallway. They were short-staffed, and every bed was full. There was no room for error. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall flew open with a loud bang. A tall man in a sharp navy blue suit marched in. It was Nick Hunter. He did not care about the warning signs. Behind him, an assistant held a tissue over a tiny cut on his hand. Nick yelled for a doctor, his loud voice echoing over the monitors. He demanded immediate attention, claiming he was the hospital's biggest donor. A terrified young doctor tried to explain this was a critical care floor, but Nick shoved him aside. "I do not care about your rules," Nick shouted. "Fix his hand right now, or you are all fired." The entire floor froze. Nurses stopped moving, and families of sick patients stared in shock. Shamika watched as Nick stepped toward a room where a man was recovering from heart surgery. She had to protect her patients. Smoothing down her white lab coat, she stepped directly into the billionaire's path. She held up her hand, forcing him to stop. "Sir, this is the ICU," she said, her voice steady. "Your friend has a minor scratch. You must wait in the lobby like everyone else." Nick stopped breathing for a second. His face turned bright red. He stepped so close to Shamika that she could smell his expensive cologne. His dark eyes locked onto hers, filled with a cold, dangerous anger. Nick did not back away. Instead, he turned his furious gaze to the young, trembling doctor standing nearby. Reaching into his tailored jacket, Nick pulled out a thick leather wallet. "Name your price," Nick barked. "I will write a check right now to bump this nobody out of the bed. If you refuse, I will buy this entire hospital tomorrow and fire every single person on this floor." The doctor opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked absolutely terrified, but Shamika did not flinch. She placed herself firmly in front of the glass doors of the recovering heart patient. Her protective instinct kicked in, stronger than any fear of a rich man's temper. "Put your money away, Mr. Hunter," Shamika said, her voice echoing clearly down the quiet hall. "Wealth does not buy you a place in line when human lives are at stake. You will wait, or you will leave." Nick's jaw dropped. He was a man who ruled boardrooms and destroyed rival companies. He was entirely unused to hearing the word no, especially from someone he considered completely beneath him. His face twisted into an ugly sneer. Nick stepped forward again, launching into a loud, vicious rant. He threw hateful, classist insults at her, calling her nothing but a glorified, uneducated maid in cheap scrubs. He insulted her background and her worth, mocking the honest life she worked so hard to build. What Nick did not notice was the silent figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A tall, handsome man in a crisp black suit watched the scene with cold, unblinking eyes. A dark scorpion tattoo rested proudly on his neck. He made no sound, simply observing the billionaire's blind rage. Why was this mysterious man watching them so closely? Shamika ignored Nick's cruel words. She refused to let his hatred break her peace. But deciding she had heard enough, Shamika turned her back on the screaming millionaire and reached for the wall phone to call hospital security. Seeing her turn away, Nick's temper finally boiled over into pure, unchecked violence. He let out a furious breath, lunged forward, and raised his heavy hand high into the air. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot through the quiet intensive care unit. Nick's heavy hand struck Shamika's face with terrifying force. The sharp impact snapped her head to the side. A plastic clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly onto the shiny floor. Losing her balance, the pregnant nurse stumbled backward and crashed hard against the nurse's station counter. Instinctively, Shamika wrapped both arms around her swollen belly to protect her unborn child. She squeezed her eyes shut, gasping for air as a burning pain spread across her cheek. The entire floor froze in pure horror. The steady beeping of the heart monitors was the only sound left in the room. A young nurse clamped both hands over her mouth, muffling a terrified gasp. A nearby doctor and security guard stood completely frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. Nobody could believe a grown man would violently strike a pregnant woman in a hospital. Nick did not look sorry at all. He slowly lowered his arm and calmly adjusted the crisp cuffs of his expensive navy blue suit. He looked down at Shamika, who was still leaning heavily against the wooden counter. "Maybe now you will learn your place," Nick sneered, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. Down the hallway, the silent man in the black suit with the scorpion tattoo slightly tilted his head. His cold, dark eyes memorized every single detail of Nick's arrogant face. The mysterious man pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket, typing a single silent message. Who was he messaging? And what would happen next? Before anyone could step forward to help Shamika, the hallway double doors swung open again. Dr. Evans, the hospital's chief of medicine, rushed in, out of breath. He looked at the injured, pregnant nurse leaning against the counter, and then he looked at the angry billionaire. Dr. Evans ignored Shamika completely. Instead, he rushed forward, grabbed Nick's hand, and practically bowed. "Mr. Hunter, I am so incredibly sorry for this disrespect," the chief pleaded. "Please, let me fix this immediately." Shamika stared at Dr. Evans in disbelief. Her cheek throbbed with hot pain, but the betrayal stung even worse. The chief of medicine did not ask if she or her unborn baby were okay. Instead, he turned his back on his best nurse and bowed to the arrogant billionaire. Nick smirked, calmly adjusting his suit jacket. "This nurse was aggressive and refused to treat my associate," Nick lied smoothly. "I had to defend myself." Instead of checking the security cameras or asking the witnesses, Dr. Evans nodded eagerly. He knew Nick Hunter funded the hospital's new pediatric wing. Money mattered much more than the truth. The chief pointed a trembling finger at Shamika. "You are fired immediately for instigating an attack on a VIP guest," Dr. Evans declared coldly. "Pack your locker and leave." Shamika opened her mouth to argue, but the shock stole her voice. The hospital security guards, the same men who had watched her save countless lives, now looked down at the floor in deep shame. Under the chief's strict orders, they stepped forward and grabbed Shamika by the arms. They marched the heavily pregnant nurse down the bright hallways like a common criminal. She was forced to hand over her hospital badge and empty her locker into a cheap cardboard box. Tears of humiliation burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She held her head high as they escorted her out the main entrance. The heavy glass doors locked behind her with a final, echoing click. Outside, the sky had turned dark gray, and a freezing rain began to pour. Shamika stood shivering on the wet pavement, clutching her small box of belongings. She had no job, no health insurance, and a baby arriving very soon. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, wiping the cold raindrops from the screen. It was an urgent email from a powerful law firm. Her heart stopped completely as she read the bold subject line. Nick Hunter was suing her for emotional distress. The freezing rain soaked through Shamika's clothes as she walked back to her small apartment. The horrible email from Nick Hunter's lawyers played over and over in her mind. He was suing her for millions. The nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, Shamika went to the store to buy food for her baby. When she swiped her debit card, the machine beeped loudly. Declined. She called her bank in a panic, only to hear the worst news possible. Nick's aggressive legal team had successfully frozen all her bank accounts. She had no money left. Heartbroken and exhausted, Shamika carried her empty bags back home. But when she reached her front door, a bright yellow paper was taped to the wood. It was an eviction notice from her landlord. Nick was using his massive wealth to pull every string in the city. He did not just want her fired. He wanted to completely erase her existence. He wanted to punish her for daring to say no. Shamika walked inside and sank onto her cheap couch. The apartment was completely dark and quiet. She gently rubbed her swollen stomach, feeling her baby kick against her hand. A heavy sadness washed over her. She had tried so hard to build an honest, independent life away from her past. But she finally realized a harsh truth. She could never fight a ruthless billionaire with just a nurse's salary. If she did not fight back now, she would lose her home, her freedom, and her baby's future. Taking a deep breath, Shamika stood up and walked into her bedroom closet. She moved a stack of old shoeboxes and pulled out a heavy metal lockbox hidden in the back. Her hands shook slightly as she unlocked it. Inside rested a sleek black burner phone. It was a direct line to a dark world she had promised to leave behind forever. Pushing her fear aside, Shamika picked up the phone and dialed a single secret number. High above the busy city, a luxurious penthouse was bathed in deep shadows. Park Hyun-woo sat silently in a leather chair, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit. The room was perfectly quiet, but a dark storm raged inside him. He had been at the hospital earlier that day. He had stood quietly in the hallway and watched the arrogant billionaire slap his pregnant foster sister. Every instinct in his body had screamed to tear Nick Hunter apart right then and there. But Hyun-woo had made a sacred promise to Shamika years ago. He had sworn to let her live a normal, independent life and never use his power unless she explicitly asked for his help. So, he had walked away, gathered his men, and waited. He knew Nick's cruel actions would eventually force her hand. Now, sitting in the dark, his private phone finally buzzed. It was a secure line that only one person in the world possessed. Hyun-woo picked it up instantly. A small, shaky voice whispered through the speaker. It was Shamika. The sound of her quiet crying cut through his chest like a sharp knife. His normally calm face turned to lethal ice. Between soft sobs, Shamika told him everything that had happened since she left the hospital. She explained how Nick had frozen her bank accounts and forced her landlord to kick her out into the cold rain. She was completely broken, terrified for her unborn baby, and finally ready to accept his protection. "Do not cry, little sister," Hyun-woo said softly, his voice dangerously calm. "Your fight is over now." He ended the call and slowly stood up from his chair. As he stepped into the dim light, the massive black scorpion tattoo on his neck seemed to shift in the shadows. 4 men dressed in dark suits immediately stepped forward, waiting for his command. Hyun-woo looked at his loyal men, his dark eyes filled with absolute, terrifying rage. "Find every piece of Nick Hunter's life," the Korean mafia boss whispered coldly, "and burn his world to ashes." Nick Hunter sat back in a velvet chair at his exclusive country club, laughing loudly with his wealthy friends. He felt like an unstoppable king. He had successfully ruined the life of the stubborn pregnant nurse who dared to tell him no. To celebrate his easy victory, Nick ordered 3 bottles of the club's most expensive champagne. When the waiter brought the bill, Nick proudly slapped his heavy black credit card onto the silver tray. He did not even look at the total, but a few minutes later, the nervous waiter returned. The young man cleared his throat, looking terrified. He politely whispered that the card had been declined. Nick's face turned bright red with sudden anger and embarrassment. He snatched the card back, yelling that their machine must be broken. He pulled out his phone to call his private banker, but the screen was already lit up with dozens of urgent emergency alerts. His stomach dropped as he opened the first message. His company's stock prices were falling faster than a rock. True panic set in as he opened another alert. His secret offshore bank accounts holding millions were completely empty. The money was simply gone. Then his phone started ringing endlessly. His top business investors were calling to pull their money out of his company all at the exact same time. Nick stood up, his hands shaking wildly. He could not understand what was happening. His massive, powerful empire was crumbling into dust in a matter of minutes. Breathing heavily, he looked around the room, desperate for help. He locked eyes with his head of security, a tough man who had protected Nick for 10 years. But the large bodyguard was not looking at Nick. He was staring down at a new text message on his own phone. The tough guard's face turned completely pale, looking like he had just seen a ghost. Without saying a word to his boss, the head of security turned around and quickly walked out the front door. Nick stood completely alone, his heart pounding. Who had just scared away his best guard? Nick rushed out of the country club, his heart hammering against his ribs. Since his head of security had vanished into the night, Nick was forced to drive himself home. He sped through the dark city streets, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He checked his rearview mirror constantly, jumping at every passing shadow. A cold, deep paranoia settled into his bones. Who had enough power to wipe out his bank accounts and scare away his bodyguard in minutes? He finally reached his giant, expensive mansion, hoping to find safety behind his high brick walls. But as his headlights swept across the long driveway, Nick slammed on the brakes. The heavy iron security gates, which were always locked tight, were pushed completely open. Nick cautiously stepped out of his car and hurried through the grand front doors. He called out for his maids, his butler, and his armed night guards. Complete silence answered him. The massive house was totally empty. Breathing heavily, Nick ran up the winding grand staircase to his master bedroom. He planned to grab his emergency cash from his wall safe and run far away. But as he burst through the heavy wooden doors, he froze completely. Sitting perfectly in the center of his neatly made, bright white bed was a single item. It was a thick, pitch-black envelope. Nick slowly walked over, his hands trembling violently. The envelope was sealed with blood-red wax, stamped with the terrifying image of a large scorpion. He ripped the thick paper open, expecting a cruel ransom note. Instead, a small silver USB drive fell out onto the blankets. Nick rushed over to his desk, opened his laptop, and shoved the drive into the side port. The computer screen flickered quickly before a video window popped open. Nick leaned in close, expecting to hear a recorded message. Instead, his blood ran freezing cold. The video was not a recording from the past. It was a live, high-definition camera feed showing Nick sitting at his desk, staring back at the screen in real time. Someone was watching his every single move. Nick slammed his laptop shut, his chest heaving with wild panic. The invisible enemy was already inside his home, watching his every move. Grabbing a heavy gym bag, Nick emptied the emergency stacks of cash from his hidden wall safe. Since his bank accounts were completely frozen, this paper money was his only weapon left. He fled the empty mansion into the rainy night, desperate to hire the city's top private investigators and underworld fixers. These were tough, dangerous men who solved impossible problems for billionaires. Nick arranged emergency meetings in dark restaurants and empty parking garages, slamming thick stacks of $100 bills onto the tables. "Find out who is doing this to me," Nick begged the first investigator, a massive man known for taking down dangerous crime rings. But the moment Nick pulled the black envelope with the blood-red scorpion seal from his pocket, the meeting instantly ended. The tough investigator's face turned completely white. He shoved the huge pile of money back across the table, shook his head, and walked away without saying a single word. Nick tried a second fixer, then a third. Every single time, the reaction was exactly the same. The most dangerous men in the city took one look at the dark scorpion crest and trembled with absolute terror. They refused his money, looking at Nick like he was already a ghost. Exhausted and soaked from the cold rain, Nick finally sat across from an old, heavily scarred fixer who supposedly feared nothing on earth. Nick pushed his last giant bag of cash forward and showed him the sealed envelope. The old man did not reach for the money. Instead, he slowly stood up, looking at Nick with a mixture of pity and deep horror. The old fixer leaned across the table and looked Nick dead in the eye. "I cannot help you, and no one else will either," the old man whispered roughly. "You did not offend a normal businessman, Hunter. You offended a god. Get your affairs in order." Nick stumbled out of the dark restaurant, his legs shaking. The old fixer's chilling words echoed in his mind. He had offended a god. If the most dangerous men in the city were terrified, Nick knew his money could not save him. He had only one option left. He had to flee the country tonight. Clutching his heavy gym bag full of cash, Nick sped toward the private airfield. The rain poured down in heavy sheets as he drove through the locked gates. His sleek white private jet sat on the dark tarmac, its engines already humming softly. It was his only ticket to safety. But Nick parked and ran toward the plane's stairs, splashing through deep puddles. He was just 50 feet away from freedom. Suddenly, the roaring sound of heavy engines filled the night air. Powerful headlights blinded him from every direction. 3 massive black SUVs sped out of the darkness, screeching to a halt and completely surrounding him. Nick froze, dropping his bag of cash onto the wet concrete. The doors opened smoothly. Nick braced himself for a violent beating, but no one raised a fist. Instead, 6 tall men in perfectly tailored black suits stepped out. They moved with cold, terrifying efficiency. Without saying a single word, they grabbed Nick's arms with iron grips. He tried to scream, but a heavy hand clamped over his mouth. They dragged him away from his jet and shoved him into the back seat of the middle SUV. Nick's heart pounded wildly as a thick, dark cloth bag was pulled roughly over his head. The world went completely black. The car sped away, driving for what felt like endless hours. Nick shook with pure terror, wondering if he was going to die. Finally, the vehicle stopped. Rough hands pulled him outside and forced him down. When the heavy bag was suddenly ripped off his head, Nick blinked against the bright lights. He was kneeling on a freezing, polished marble floor inside a massive underground boardroom. Who was waiting for him? Nick blinked hard as his eyes adjusted to the bright lights. He was kneeling on a freezing marble floor in the center of a massive, echoing room. At the far end of a long wooden table sat a man calmly sipping tea. It was the same tall, handsome man in the black suit from the hospital hallway. Park Hyun-woo set his delicate cup down and looked at Nick with cold, dark eyes. The large scorpion tattoo on his neck looked incredibly dangerous in the bright light. Desperate and terrified, Nick tried to fall back on his usual weapon. He puffed out his chest and tried to sound powerful. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Nick yelled, his voice shaking slightly. "I know the mayor. I have the best lawyers in the entire country. When I get out of here, I will have you arrested and locked away forever." Hyun-woo did not blink. He did not yell back or look angry. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across his handsome face. The silence in the room was heavier than a concrete block. Without saying a word, the mafia boss reached out and slid a sleek silver tablet across the long, polished table. It spun perfectly and stopped right in front of Nick's knees. Nick looked down at the glowing screen. It was playing a highly clear video. It was the security camera footage from the hospital intensive care unit. Nick watched in absolute horror as the video showed him raising his heavy hand and violently slapping the pregnant nurse. The terrible sound of the slap echoed softly from the tablet's speakers. Hyun-woo slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. The chilling smile left his face, replaced by a look of pure, deadly promise. "You thought she was just a helpless nobody who could not fight back," Hyun-woo whispered, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a sharp knife. "But you struck the only sister of the Korean mafia." Nick stared at the terrifying mafia boss, all waiting for a weapon to be drawn. But Park Hyun-woo did not believe in simple violence. He believed in perfect justice. Hyun-woo snapped his fingers, and a lawyer in a sharp suit stepped out of the shadows. The lawyer placed a thick stack of legal papers directly in front of Nick's shaking knees. "Your punishment is not death," Hyunwoo said, his voice as cold as ice. "Your punishment is becoming exactly what you hate." The boss explained the brutal terms. If Nick wanted to live to see tomorrow, he had to sign away every single thing he owned. His massive mansion, his private jets, his luxury cars, and his company patents were all to be transferred immediately. The heavy gym bag of emergency cash Nick had tried to escape with was already burning in a metal barrel nearby. Nick sobbed openly, tears streaming down his face. But he had no choice. With a trembling hand, he signed his powerful signature over and over again. Hyunwoo made sure every single penny of Nick's billionaire empire was legally donated to a charity that supported underprivileged single mothers. It was the ultimate revenge for the pregnant nurse Nick had abused. In less than 1 hour, the arrogant king of the city was reduced to absolute, literal poverty. He was no longer a millionaire. He was a nobody. Once the final paper was stamped, the men in black suits grabbed Nick by the arms and dragged him away. Another dark bag was shoved over his head. After a short, terrifying drive, the car door suddenly slid open. Nick was violently kicked out of the moving vehicle. He hit the wet, dirty pavement hard, rolling several times before stopping. Pulling the bag off his head, he looked up at the familiar, bright emergency room signs. He had been dumped in the exact same hospital parking lot where he had Shamika fired, left freezing in the rain with nothing but the ruined clothes on his back. How would the broken billionaire survive the night? It had been 1 miserable week since the billionaire lost his entire world. Nick Hunter now looked like a common street beggar. His expensive navy blue suit was torn, stained with thick mud, and smelled like garbage. For 7 days, he had slept in freezing alleys, ignored by the very city he used to rule. His rich friends had immediately blocked his phone calls. The police had laughed at his crazy story, seeing that his charity donation paperwork was perfectly legal. Nick finally realized a harsh, bitter truth. The terrible mafia boss would never listen to him. There was only one person on Earth who could call off the dogs and save his life: the pregnant nurse he had so cruelly humiliated. With his expensive leather shoes falling apart, Nick walked miles across the city to Shamika's old apartment building. The sky opened up, and a heavy, freezing rain began to pour, soaking him to the bone just like the night he was dumped at the hospital. He dragged his tired feet up the stairs and collapsed onto his knees in front of her door. He was completely broken. Nick banged his dirty fists against the cheap wood, sobbing loudly into the empty hallway. He begged for mercy, screaming out apologies for the violent slap and his terrible arrogance. He promised to do whatever she wanted if she just gave him a second chance. The heavy lock suddenly clicked. Nick held his breath as the wooden door slowly swung open. He looked up with red, tear-filled eyes, expecting to see the tired, poor woman in cheap hospital scrubs. Instead, Shamika stood tall and proud before him. She was not wearing her nurse uniform. She was dressed in an elegant, incredibly expensive designer dress, looking like absolute royalty. Her face was calm and completely unafraid. Nick's heart stopped completely when he noticed the large shadow moving inside the apartment. Standing quietly in the dark room right behind her was the terrifying mafia boss, Park Hyun-woo. What would the powerful brother and sister do to him now? Nick fell forward, pressing his dirty forehead against the wet doorframe. "Please, Shamika," he sobbed uncontrollably, completely ignoring the terrifying mafia boss standing in the shadows behind her. "I am so sorry. I was cruel. I have learned my lesson. Just tell him to give my life back." He clasped his muddy hands together, begging the pregnant nurse he had once treated like garbage. Shamika looked down at the broken, shivering man at her feet. A few weeks ago, her kind heart would have felt pity for him. She used to make excuses for bullies, believing everyone deserved a second chance. But that weakness was completely gone now. She rested a hand on her baby bump, feeling a new, fierce strength. She finally understood that some people only regret their actions when they lose their power. "You are not sorry for what you did to me," Shamika said, her voice perfectly calm. "You are only sorry that you messed with the wrong family." Nick opened his mouth to argue, but Shamika held up her hand, silencing him instantly. I will not let my child grow up in a world where rich men can hurt people and just buy their way out, she continued. Forgiveness is earned through honest actions, Nick, not demanded with empty tears. Without another word, Shamika stepped back into the warm apartment. The heavy wooden door swung shut, locking with a loud final click. Nick was left completely alone in the freezing rain. He buried his face in his hands, crying in total despair. Suddenly, bright red and blue lights began flashing against the wet brick walls. The loud, screaming wails of multiple police sirens grew closer and closer. While Nick was sleeping in the streets, Park Hyun-woo had anonymously emailed all of Nick's secret tax fraud and embezzlement files directly to the FBI. As the police cars skidded to a stop, trapping him in the alley, Nick realized his punishment had only just begun. Who was stepping out of the police cars? 3 months later, the morning sun poured through the giant glass windows of a private VIP hospital suite. The room looked more like a 5-star hotel than a medical center. Lying in a soft, comfortable bed, Shamika looked down at the tiny, sleeping face of her newborn baby girl. A tear of pure joy rolled down her cheek. She was no longer a stressed, overworked nurse struggling to survive. She was safe, surrounded by absolute peace. Standing quietly by the door was Park Hyun-woo. He still wore his sharp black suit, but the dangerous look in his eyes was gone. He smiled warmly at his new niece. Hyun-woo had bought this entire state-of-the-art hospital just to ensure his sister had the safest place in the world to deliver her baby. Shamika looked at her powerful brother and finally accepted her reality. She did not have to hide from her past anymore. She could be a gentle mother and a woman of peace, perfectly backed by an untouchable empire of power. Down the bright, spotless hallway, an older man in a stained gray uniform pushed a heavy mop bucket. He paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead. It was Dr. Evans, the former chief of medicine who had so quickly fired Shamika to please a billionaire. Since the scandal broke, no hospital would hire him as a doctor. Now, he cleaned the floors of the very hospital Shamika's family owned. As Dr. Evans pushed his mop past the open door of the VIP suite, he saw Shamika holding her beautiful baby. He quickly lowered his head in deep, bitter shame and hurried away. Nick Hunter was locked inside a federal prison, his wealth and arrogance completely gone. The people who had preyed on the weak had finally faced the ultimate consequences. As Shamika kissed her baby's warm forehead, she knew the storm was over. Justice had been fully served, and a beautiful new life had just begun. True power is never measured by how much fear you can cause, but by how much peace you can protect. Never mistake someone's quiet humility for weakness, because the most dangerous storms always hide behind the calmest smiles. If you loved seeing ultimate justice served in today's story, please hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us what you thought of Nick's punishment. Be sure to share this video with anyone who loves a great comeback and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next thrilling tale. Thanks for watching.